Beginning Chapter 2 of Opposing Viewpoints White-Collar Crime on page 25, starting with a quotation, "When large-scale cases of corruption emerged, demonstrating that often corporate wrongdoing was not caused by rogue employees but by a specific corporate culture, the focus began to shift to aligning organizational culture with anti-corruption goals." The title of this chapter is How Private Sector Corruption Works. The subtitle is The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. This excerpted viewpoint from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, provides a detailed look at how corruption impacts economies when it comes from the private sector. While cries of bribery are most often leveled at government officials or people in positions of public power, there's always someone on the other side who should probably not be offering the bribe in the first place. On the other hand, bad ethics can also come from failures in self-reporting from executives with their eyes on the bottom line. Established in 1997 under a slightly different name, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime focuses on studying various kinds of illegal activity around the world. As you read, consider the following questions. In what ways were some of the early compliance programs used by regulators problematic according to this viewpoint? 2, what is rational choice theory? And 3, what does this viewpoint recommend management do to combat a corporate culture of wrongdoing? Stricter and more nuanced regulation requires and incentivizes companies to strengthen compliance with rules, but also to focus on their values and develop an ethical culture. Stakeholders such as employees, customers, shareholders, business partners, and civil society expect even higher standards of integrity and ethical business conduct than the imposition of mere rules can enforce. Focusing on rules and regulations alone will often fall short of meeting these higher expectations of ethical business practices. Therefore, an effective ethics and compliance program which goes beyond mere compliance and aims to foster a culture of integrity should include internal, external, and collective measures. Subsection title, From Legal to Behavioral Approaches. Legal compliance approaches that merely rely on rules to be enforced by the company itself with threats of criminal or civil punishment to back them have historically been the primary mechanism to address corruption in the private sector. Several governments and international organizations have issued guidelines to help companies map their anti-corruption ethics and compliance programs. UNODC, for example, has published an anti-corruption ethics and compliance program for business, a practical guide, and an anti-corruption ethics and compliance handbook for business in cooperation with the OECD and the World Bank. The International Standards Organization, ISO, has even approved a standardized anti-bribery management process, the ISO 37001. However, early compliance programs were problematic because companies tended to focus on processes such as enacting codes of conduct and implementing internal rules and procedures without assessing the outcomes of these processes and the impact they had on ethical and behavioral issues within the companies. Hodges and Steinholtz, 2017. Therefore, such processes did not disrupt companies' problematic business models. Compliance programs were seen as separate from core business operations, and programs are therefore enabled to change the values and working methods of the organization. As a result, corporate cultures of wrongdoing remain largely intact. When large-scale cases of corruption emerged, demonstrating that often corporate wrongdoing was not caused by rogue employees but by a specific corporate culture, the focus began to shift to aligning organizational culture with anti-corruption goals. Torcello, 2018. Legal approaches to corporate liability address this shift through the lens of orthodox economics and rational choice theory. See, for example, Becker, 1968. In a nutshell, the assumption was that the right mix of detection and sanction was the key to determining misbehavior. Relying exclusively on deterrence in practice is, however, too costly and ineffective, both economically and socially. See again, Hodges and Steinholtz, 2017. Psychological and behavioral science research shows that changes in behavior motivated by incentives and sanctions came at a high cost. These changes require the provision of financial and personnel resources, for example, surveillance systems and systems of incentives and related tracking. Moreover, anti-corruption Ethics and compliance programs strongly based on detection and sanction send a message of distrust within an organization. Surveillance can have a particularly negative impact on corporate culture. In an environment of distrust, employees may be reluctant to voluntarily observe or disclose breaches of internal policies and may feel disengaged and under continual suspicion. To overcome a corporate culture of wrongdoing, top management needs to make clear that it does not advocate or condone wrongdoing, and that after a proper root cause analysis and investigation, intentional corruption must be punished. In technical jargon, this is often referred to as tone from the top. Such a policy of zero tolerance of corruption should be communicated within a framework that couples the stick of punishment with the carrot of positive messages about the type of behavior that the company expects from its employees. ... Conducting root cause analysis and investigations before determining whether punishment is required also contributes towards building a just culture where fairness is perceived and where people can learn from their mistakes. In such an environment, it will be possible to determine the true cause of the problem, which might be, for example, that targets set by senior management are impossible to meet any other way, and to learn from the exercise and fix the underlying problem rather than just blaming and punishing a scapegoat. It is increasingly accepted that compared to legal compliance approaches, behavioral change approaches premised on value-based programs lead to higher levels of ethical awareness, more employees seeking advice on ethical issues, and a greater likelihood of employees reporting violations, thus minimizing damage. Value-based programs are premised on the assumption that employees engage with whichever values are present in the company, pro-social or anti-social, and adopt them as their own. When these values are oriented towards pro-social engagement, employees are more likely to comply with rules even when they are not monitored. Key elements in value-based programs are treating employees fairly, rewarding ethical behavior, remedying unintentional unethical behavior, and punishing criminal behavior. From Trevino and others, 2006. A step further in this direction is to develop a values pledge. This is a collective commitment of organizations to become truly values-driven organizations and to support the creation of value-based business environments. The UK Values Alliance is a good example of an initiative which brings together individuals and companies aiming to develop a values pledge in the UK. Research findings and practical experience suggest that value-based models are not only as or more effective than traditional coercion-based models, but they are also much better at encouraging voluntary compliance with the rules and lessening the difficulties and costs associated with creating and maintaining effective surveillance mechanisms needed for sanction-based models. For a broader discussion of values and value-based programs for businesses, see Module 11 of the E4J University Module Series on Integrity and Ethics. You see the next subsection, Effective Anti-Corruption Ethics and Compliance Programs. Having the full support and commitment from all levels of management is essential for creating a culture that is driven by ethical values and implementing an effective anti-corruption ethics and compliance program. UNODC 2013B. When developing the program, consideration needs to be given to oversight mechanisms with internal controls and record keeping. Effective programs also have clear, visible, and accessible policies prohibiting corruption, mitigating particular corruption risks, and addressing violations. They also establish channels for reporting on corruption. UNODC 2015. For larger companies, the program should engage with business partners, subsidiaries, and intermediaries. Employee training and promotion and incentivizing of ethical behavior and compliance are essential for effective implementation. The program as a whole should be reviewed and evaluated periodically. OECD, UNODC, and World Bank 2013. The effectiveness of measures in place also needs to be improved from time to time. Larger companies are encouraged to expand measures to third parties and to share good practices. For example, by participating in anti-corruption collective action projects, which are discussed further below, companies should not only focus on their own culture for ethics, but also engage with business partners and their supply chains. Intermediaries are often the weak link, and the public perception does not focus on the supplier itself, but also the companies that contract them. DC 2013B. In addition to ensuring compliance with national and international regulations, companies should thus adopt a proactive approach to strengthen business integrity and ethics in their supply chains regarding their corporate responsibility and sustainable business practices. Finally, companies can also engage in collective action, such as sharing experiences, working groups, or joining initiatives such as the United Nations Global Compact. In environments in which unethical practices are prevalent, companies could resort to collective action to try to change status quo. For example, they could get regulators to intervene or set standards in areas such as supply chains. Such collective action is addressed below in further detail. Businesses may require different approaches to create an effective ethical culture owing to their characteristics, for example, in terms of size, legal status, and/or complexity. There is no one-size-fits-all model, but the underlying principles apply to both large and small companies, including startups. And this cites the OECD, UNODC, and World Bank of 2013. For example, in a large business, one manifestation of the tone from the top may be a video statement on the website or a postcard with a quote from the management representative sent to the employees, since it is not possible for the CEO to meet in person with all employees. In a owner-led smaller business, one-on-one talks with the employees raising the importance of integrity as a core value of the company would be appropriate. While a small company or startup may not need to draft an elaborate code of ethics, although that will change as the business grows. A multinational may need to consider the best way to express its values in different contexts and pay attention to different country regulations to which its staff will be held accountable. The multinational will also need to assess the risk of unethical behavior in the different environments in which it operates to select the appropriate controls that it needs to institute. The multinational corporation is also often faced with the problem of cultural or regional relevance. Should there be one code that applies throughout all the countries where it operates, or should there be a multiplicity of codes to make provision for different contexts? The most elegant solution is to have a global code that provides high-level guidance on the values of the company, supported by country guidelines that provide a level of flexibility but never in contradiction to the global values or applicable law, which may be that of another jurisdiction, such as the UK Bribery Act or the US FCPA, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, since a multinational company may be subject to those statutes wherever it does business. The next subsection, the penultimate subsection, risk management approaches to fighting corruption in the private sector. Again, corruption risk assessments are essential to ensure that resources are being applied where they most matter, and to reinforce transparency, build trust, and reduce corruption. To prevent and fight corruption effectively, the company needs to know how and where the crime happened. Such knowledge enables the targeting of real and not just perceived problems within a given organization's processes and structures, and eventually the identification and application of relevant measures aimed at resolving these problems. Corruption risk assessments can be crucial because while managers might acknowledge the risk of corruption on a more general level, they might not know or realize the exact mechanisms through which their company is exposed to corruption. In recent years, several international organizations have developed tools and mechanisms to support the private sector's need to identify and respond to corruption risks, such as risk assessment tools that have been developed, for example, by the United Nations Global Compact, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treasury Commission, that's COSO, the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative, RAI, and Transparency International. The last subsection, titled Business Partners Due Diligence, reads as follows. To externalize business risks and for other reasons, companies sometimes outsource operations to third parties such as agents, consultants, distributors, subcontractors, resellers, foreign subsidiaries, business partners, and joint ventures, and in general, anyone with the capacity to act on behalf of the company or whose conduct can end up benefiting the company. However, working with third parties presents significant corruption risks. For example, research from the OECD 2014 indicated that 75% of all transnational bribery enforcement actions between 1999 and 2014 involved payments through intermediaries. The practice of using intermediaries to channel bribes is so extensive that the international community responded by tightening company responsibility by requiring due diligence to be performed when dealing with third parties. The duty to supervise the behavior of third parties emerges from the principle that anyone who creates a situation of risk or danger is obliged to adopt appropriate precautionary measures to serve as protection against the occurrence of the harm. To address third-party risk, companies first need to map the third parties globally and understand the purpose of each commercial relationship. This information allows companies to classify their third parties into a risk matrix and adopt appropriately proportioned measures to mitigate the identified risks. In many cases, due diligence processes result in a reduction in the number of business partners and in the rationalization of operations, often to the benefit of the corporation. Risk mitigation measures range from getting the business partner's acknowledgement and commitment to abide by the law and by the company's code of conduct to establish contractual safeguards, including audit and termination rights, and carrying out third parties' anti-bribery training. Part of the due diligence process involves checking the reputation of potential business partners against different databases. For example, those containing sanctioned persons, blacklisted persons, politically exposed persons, PEEPs, and adverse media reports in local language. If the third party shows up on these lists, then the company can undertake a more thorough investigation, enhanced due diligence. For a discussion of the evolution of third-party due diligence, see Transparency International UK 2016. As with employees, measures aimed at mitigating third-party risks can take different shapes. Companies may concentrate on avoiding working with business partners suspected of corruption. An approach based on surveillance and sanctions will focus on the selection process of business partners and on legal measures to protect the company if the third party subsequently violates the rules. By contrast, a values-based approach aims at working with partners who share common values and at helping them to create the right corporate culture to avoid corruption. This distinction is especially important in contexts of systemic corporation corruption, where local business partners are hired for a specific process, such as customs clearance and obtaining licenses or permits, and may have little choice but to pay bribes to deliver the goods or services to their clients. In a more coercive compliance relationship with large companies, local agents might be inclined to hide their activities. In a more open relationship, local agents can engage with large companies in a collective strategy to reduce corruption in that specific business process. Chapter 2 ends on page 33.